Welcome to Hardware Asylum. We're back working on the scam case. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the scam case is a baby AT mini tower chassis that I got off of Macari. The person shipped it out of New York in the original box and didn't bother to wrap the inside of it at all or put the box in another box. And as you can imagine, it showed up broken. That video is on the channel. I'll link it down in the show notes so you can check it out. This chassis has since become a donor machine. The motherboard out of this box went into the classic case build. Some of the I/O controllers got reused in some other projects. And since the bezel was broken, I've spent some time and found a replacement bezel. You wouldn't believe how difficult it is to find bezels in this shape for mini tower chassis. And this one has a slightly different configuration than what came on the scam case. The purpose of the new scam case build is to build a RestroMod. Before everybody gets a little upset and writes down in the comments below, my RestroMod will be using vintage hardware but then upgrading certain components to their modern equivalents. For instance, the power supply. We have an AT style power supply in here that has live power going to the rocker switch. Well, with this particular bezel, we have a much different style switch that will have to be adapted. And that got me thinking, well, why don't we just upgrade the power supply? We'll use an ATX style switching mechanism, which will allow us to have a more efficient power supply, a much quieter fan. So before we can get started, I'm going to have to take this chassis apart. And if I remember correctly, there is a little bit of battery damage in the metal from the leaky battery that was on this particular motherboard. That I did repair. That video is on the channel as well. So what we're going to do is get the cover off of this, take a look inside, and I'll go over some of the modifications that are going to happen to this particular case. Now with the cover removed, we can see inside this is your standard mini tower chassis. We have two external 5 1/4 bays, we have two external 3.5 inch bays, we have two internal 3.5 inch bays for hard drives and whatnot. Our power supply is a 230 watt, which is really good for the era. This was a 386 machine after all. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be using a few modern components in this particular build, and the first one is going to be power supply. We have a couple of choices that we can look at. They're both from Silverstone, and they're both products that I've reviewed on hardwareasylum.com. I'll link them down in the show notes below. But we have a Silverstone SFX-L 500 watt 80 plus gold power supply. This is a much smaller and more compact PSU and considerably more efficient. We also have another SFX power supply. This is the SX750, an 80 plus platinum rated power supply. Silverstone makes some really great power supplies, and they're one of the first companies to offer an SFX power supply. This particular one, the 500 watt, which is an SFX-L, is one of the older designs, and they needed to go a little bit larger to get the power efficiency at 80 plus gold at this particular wattage. As the power supplies have matured, we can now get the standard SFX in a 750 watt, which is also 80 plus platinum. Now for my particular build, either one of these power supplies would work great. If I went with the smaller SFX, of course I'm going to not need 750 watts, but I do need a lot of extra space. We do have cables that need to be routed. It opens up some opportunities for extra CD-ROMs and whatnot. And as you know, the mini tower chassis is quite small. Now, of course, if we're going to compare this with the standard AT power supply, we have the one that came out of the scam case. And as you can see, there's quite the size difference. Depth-wise, it's the same as the SFX-L. Width-wise, it's considerably smaller. To get this power supply to fit, Silverstone includes a bracket. Now, of course, for cabling, we do have the issue of the AT style power connector, and for that we'll just be using a standard adapter. And since we only need to concern ourselves with shorting these two leads together to activate the power supply, we can wire this directly into the power switch on the chassis. The next planned modification might be a little controversial, and that is adding a cooling fan to the front of the chassis. We need to provide a little bit of airflow, at least in the front part of the chassis. And for that we'll be using a Noctua Redux 80mm fan. And to keep a little bit of the purity, I'm just going to drill a couple of holes in the corner, offset the fan a bit, so that we can get some airflow through the opening, which is normally reserved for the PC speaker. When I picked up this bezel off of eBay, it was severely yellowed and went through the standard retro brighting process, and as you can see, it is really bright white now, almost brighter than some of the other cases that I have retro brighted in the past. There were a number of components that came with it, including a reset switch and 3 LEDs. Unfortunately, it did not come with the power switch. Now, since this bezel didn't come with a power switch, I needed to get a little creative. And for that, I sampled a design from the reset switch. This is a holder that spans across these 2 pins on the bezel. The power switch has a very similar configuration. So I was able to design and 3D print this holder. Now, of course, you can't just print any holder for any kind of a switch. So I was able to pick up a switch like this off of Mouser. I can put a link down in the description below. Now, much like on a factory switch, we are going to solder these wires directly to it. I have a little bit of heat shrink here that will go cover up our connection. And when we're done, we'll have something that looks a little bit like that. Now, the way my bracket works, the switch slides into the void here, and it just slides all the way down. There's a bit of a friction fit. Give it a little bit of a press. And at that point, it will lock into place. Of course, this would be a great time to test that the switch actually works. So we'll just put a meter on our pins here. That's the off position. That's on. This build is starting to look like a case again. We have the front bezel reattached, and of course the Noctua fan has been installed. To keep a little bit of the purity of this particular chassis, I didn't break out the Dremel and open up that hole, but that might be a future mod if it deems to be necessary. I was able to straighten out all the metals, so the case is once again square and looking pretty good. Next step will be to put a build into the scam case and maybe give it a brand new name. So if you have any suggestions, write them in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.